If you are going to cry, do it somewhere I cannot see." The words fell cold and sharp, slicing through the quiet air of the penthouse like a blade that had been used too many times to care about the damage it left behind. Sophie Bennett stood frozen near the doorway, her hands trembling slightly as she held a folded linen cloth against her chest, her eyes glassy but refusing to let the tears fall any further. Across the room, Alexander Hayes, a powerful chief executive officer known for building a billion-dollar empire before most men reached middle age, did not even look up from the documents in his hand. The city lights stretched behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glowing like a world that belonged entirely to him, a world where weakness had no place. Sophie lowered her gaze, swallowing the ache rising in her throat, turning quietly as if her pain were something she needed to hide, something that had no right to exist in a place this perfect, this controlled. She stepped out into the long marble hallway, her footsteps soft, almost invisible, as if she had trained herself over time to disappear without leaving a trace. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The silence in the hallway felt heavier than the words he had spoken. Sophie paused for just a moment, pressing her back lightly against the wall, her breathing uneven as she tried to steady herself. In her pocket, her phone buzzed again, the same hospital number flashing across the screen, the same reminder that time was running out for someone she loved more than anything in this world. She closed her eyes briefly, forcing strength into a body that was already running on empty, then straightened her shoulders and walked forward. Inside the penthouse, Alexander continued reading, unaware that the absence he had just created was already beginning to take shape. He did not notice the faint scent of lavender that always lingered after Sophie cleaned, nor the quiet order she maintained in every corner of his home. To him, she was simply part of the background, a role easily replaced, a presence that required no thought. Yet as the night stretched on, something subtle began to shift. The tea that usually appeared beside his desk at exactly the same time each evening did not come. The soft glow of the hallway lamp that was always turned on before midnight remained dark. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in his home did not feel controlled. It felt empty, unfamiliar, almost unsettling. But Alexander Hayes, a man who had built his life on control, did not yet understand that some silences were not peaceful. Some silences were warnings. And somewhere in that same city, walking under the cold glow of streetlights with tears she refused to let fall, Sophie Bennett was beginning to make a choice that would change both of their lives forever. The night did not end when Sophie Bennett walked out of the penthouse. It followed her, clinging to her skin like the cold air that swept through the empty streets of Manhattan. The wind cut through her thin coat as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her breath visible in the late hour, her fingers tightening around her phone as it buzzed again. She did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. The hospital had called 3 times already. This time, she answered. Her voice was steady at first, almost too steady, as if she were holding herself together by force alone. "Yes, this is Sophie." A pause. Then the shift. Her expression changed, her eyes widening as the words on the other end landed heavier than anything she had heard that night. "I understand," she said quietly, but her voice trembled despite her effort. "I will be there as soon as I can." She ended the call and stood still for a moment, the noise of the city fading into the background as everything narrowed down to one single thought. Time was running out. She started walking faster, her steps quick, purposeful, but uneven as exhaustion caught up with her. She had worked a full shift, skipped dinner, and ignored the growing ache in her body for days, all to keep up with a life that was slowly slipping beyond her control. Her savings were gone. Every dollar she earned had already been promised to something more urgent, more important. Inside her mind, numbers repeated like a cruel rhythm. Hospital bills, medication costs, days left. She reached the subway entrance and descended the stairs, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting a harsh glow over the worn tiles and tired faces around her. She swiped the last of her transit balance, hesitating for a fraction of a second before pushing through the turnstile. There was no room left for hesitation. As the train roared into the station, she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in the cold, trying to hold in everything that threatened to break through. Across the city, Alexander Hayes remained in his office, unaware of the storm unfolding beyond his walls. He flipped through another report, his expression unchanged, his posture composed, but the rhythm of his night had shifted in ways he could not quite define. He reached for his glass, then stopped. Something felt off. His gaze moved briefly toward the doorway where Sophie usually appeared without being called, always at the exact same time, always with the same quiet precision. Tonight, there was nothing. He leaned back slightly, exhaling as if dismissing the thought, yet his attention drifted again, pulled toward the absence he refused to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Sophie sat on the train, her head resting lightly against the cold window as the city blurred past her. She closed her eyes for just a moment, but memories filled the darkness instantly. Her mother in a hospital bed years ago. The same machines. The same helpless waiting. She had promised herself she would never let it happen again. Not to someone she loved. Not if she could fight it. The train slowed, then stopped, the doors sliding open with a sharp mechanical sound. Sophie stood, steadying herself as she stepped out onto the platform, her determination returning stronger than her fear. Whatever it took, she would find a way, even if it meant losing everything else. And back in the silent penthouse, Alexander Hayes finally looked up, his eyes settling on the empty space where someone used to stand, a faint crease forming between his brows as a thought surfaced for the first time that night, small, unfamiliar, and impossible to ignore. Something was missing, and for reasons he could not explain, it mattered. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion, the kind of place where time did not move forward so much as it pressed down on everyone inside it. Sophie Bennett walked quickly through the automatic doors, her shoes echoing faintly against the polished floor as her eyes scanned the hallway signs. With quiet urgency, she had been here too many times to get lost, yet every visit felt heavier than the last. At the end of the corridor, behind a half-closed door, a steady beeping sound marked the fragile line between hope and loss. She slowed as she approached, her hand hovering near the handle for just a second before she pushed it open. Inside, the room was dim except for the soft glow of medical monitors. On the bed lay her younger brother, Daniel Bennett, his skin pale against the white sheets, a thin blanket rising and falling with each shallow breath. Tubes and wires traced across his body like silent reminders of everything she could not control. Sophie stepped closer, her expression softening instantly, the tension in her shoulders giving way to something deeper, something more tender. "Hey, you," she whispered, forcing a small smile as she brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. "I am here." Daniel did not respond, but his fingers twitched faintly, enough for her to take his hand gently in both of hers, warming it as if she could pass strength into him through touch alone. The doctor entered quietly a moment later, his face calm, but carrying the weight of difficult truths. "Miss Bennett," he said softly, "we need to talk about the next steps." Sophie nodded, already bracing herself. They stepped into the hallway, the door closing behind them with a muted click. The doctor spoke carefully, explaining treatment options, risks, and the reality that time was becoming their greatest enemy. The procedure he needed was complex, urgent, and far beyond anything she could afford. Sophie listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on the floor as the numbers filled the air between them, numbers that felt less like solutions and more like walls closing in. "I will find a way," she said finally, her voice quiet but unwavering. The doctor hesitated, then gave a small nod, as if he had heard that promise before from people who had nothing left but determination. When Sophie returned to the room, she sat beside Daniel and leaned closer, her voice softer now, almost a secret meant only for him. "You remember when we were kids and the power went out," she said gently. "You were scared of the dark, but you pretended you were not, so I would not worry." She smiled, faintly, her thumb brushing over his hand. "I told you then that I would always find the light, no matter what. I meant that." Her gaze drifted to the monitor, watching the steady rhythm, holding on to it as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Across the city, morning light began to creep through the tall windows of Alexander Hayes's penthouse, casting long shadows across a space that felt unfamiliar in its stillness. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty counter where a cup of tea should have been waiting. His reflection in the glass caught his attention for a moment, his expression sharper than usual, as if something beneath the surface had begun to shift without his permission. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then set it back down. This was not his concern, he told himself. People came and went. That was the nature of things. Yet as he walked through the penthouse, small details began to stand out in ways they never had before. A jacket that had been repaired without him noticing. Files organized with a precision he had never questioned. The quiet order that had once felt effortless now seemed deliberate, intentional, human. He paused near the doorway where he had spoken those words the night before, his jaw tightening slightly as the memory replayed, sharper than it should have been. Back in the hospital room, Sophie leaned her forehead lightly against Daniel's hand, closing her eyes for just a second as exhaustion washed over her. She did not allow herself to cry. Not here. Not now. There was too much at stake. She straightened, her resolve returning, her voice steady once more as she whispered, "I am not going to lose you. No matter what it takes." And somewhere deep within the city, two lives were moving on separate paths, both unaware that the choices being made in silence would soon collide in a way neither of them could ignore. The next morning arrived without warmth, without softness, carrying only the quiet pressure of expectations that never stopped waiting. Sophie Bennett had not slept. She sat in the rigid hospital chair beside her brother's bed, her back aching, her eyes heavy but alert, as if rest itself had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The steady rhythm of the monitor continued, each sound grounding her, reminding her that he was still here, still fighting. A nurse entered briefly, adjusting an intravenous line, offering a gentle smile that carried both kindness and distance, the kind that came from seeing too many stories like this one. Sophie thanked her quietly, then stood, stretching her stiff limbs as she looked down at Daniel. "I am going to fix this," she whispered, more to herself than to him, as if saying it out loud could make it real. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope, the last of her savings, the last attempt she had made to hold everything together. It was not enough. It would never be enough. The realization settled heavily, but it did not break her. Instead, it sharpened something inside her, something determined, something unwilling to surrender. She walked out into the hallway, her steps steady now, her mind already moving through possibilities, through risks she had once promised herself she would never take. Back across the city, Alexander Hayes stepped into a boardroom filled with polished glass, quiet authority, and people who waited for his decisions as if they were law. He moved with the same control he always had, his voice calm, precise, every word measured. Yet beneath that surface, something small continued to press against his focus. During the meeting, a senior partner spoke about expansion, about profit margins and projections, but Alexander's attention drifted for a fraction of a second, his mind catching on an image he could not easily dismiss. A woman standing silently in a doorway, holding back tears she believed no one cared to see. He blinked, returning to the present, his expression hardening as if to correct the lapse. "Continue," he said, his tone sharper than before. The room responded immediately, but the moment lingered longer than it should have. Hours later, when the meeting ended, Alexander returned to his office, closing the door behind him as the noise of the building faded into a distant hum. He stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, then crossed the room toward his desk. Something caught his attention. A small, neatly folded piece of fabric rested near the edge, something he had not noticed before. He picked it up, recognizing it as a handkerchief, freshly pressed, the stitching along the edges done with care. For a brief second, he frowned, trying to remember when it had been placed there. He could not. He set it down, but the question remained, lingering in the quiet space around him. Meanwhile, Sophie stepped outside the hospital into the pale light of late morning, her phone in hand, her heart steady but heavy. She scrolled through a list of contacts, numbers she had avoided calling, names tied to opportunities that came with consequences. Her thumb hovered over one in particular, a private staffing agency known for placing workers in high-demand environments, jobs that paid more but asked for more in return. She hesitated only for a moment before pressing call. Her voice was clear when she spoke, her decision already made. "I am available for full-time placement," she said. Immediately, as she ended the call, she looked back at the hospital building, her expression firm, her path chosen. If the world demanded more from her, then she would give more, no matter the cost. And somewhere far above the streets, standing alone in a quiet office that suddenly felt larger than it should have, Alexander Hayes turned the handkerchief over in his hands, his brow tightening slightly as a thought surfaced, unfamiliar and unwelcome. When had he stopped noticing the people who made his life possible, and why did it suddenly feel like he had lost something he did not even know he needed? The call came sooner than Sophie Bennett expected. She was still standing outside the hospital, the cold air brushing against her face, when her phone rang again. This time, it was not the hospital. The number was unfamiliar, but she already knew who it was. She answered immediately. The voice on the other end was direct, professional, and without hesitation. We have an opening. Private residence. High-profile client. Demanding environment. Full-time. Immediate start. The pay was more than she had ever earned in a single month. It was the kind of number that could change everything. The kind that could mean the difference between watching her brother fade away and giving him a real chance to live. There was only one condition. No personal distractions. No missed shifts. Absolute availability. Sophie closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her chest. I will take it, she said, her voice steady despite everything inside her that wanted to hesitate. Good, the voice replied. You start tomorrow morning. The call ended, leaving her standing there with a future that had just shifted in a direction she could not fully see yet. She looked back at the hospital one more time, her expression softening as she whispered under her breath, hold on. Just a little longer. I am fixing this. The next day arrived quickly, almost too quickly, as if time itself had decided not to wait for her to catch up. Sophie stood in front of a new building, taller, colder, and more imposing than any place she had worked before. The glass exterior reflected the city back at itself, endless and distant, a place where people like her were meant to pass through quietly, not belong. She adjusted her coat, her posture straightening as she stepped inside, her face calm, her emotions carefully locked away. This was not about comfort. This was about survival. Across the city, Alexander Hayes moved through his day with the same precision that had built his reputation, yet the absence in his home had begun to follow him into places it did not belong. During a meeting, he paused mid-sentence, his mind drifting for a fraction of a second, distracted by something he could not define. His assistant noticed immediately. Is everything all right? She asked carefully. Alexander nodded without looking at her. Of course. Continue. His tone was firm, but the moment had already broken something subtle in the rhythm of his control. Back at the new residence, Sophie was given a brief tour, the instructions clear, the expectations higher than anything she had experienced before. The woman in charge spoke quickly, listing responsibilities, rules, and consequences in a tone that left no room for error. Sophie listened closely, absorbing every detail, every expectation, because failure was not an option she could afford. As the orientation ended, she was handed a uniform, crisp and unfamiliar, a symbol of a new beginning that did not feel like one. She changed quickly, tying her hair back, looking at herself in the mirror for a moment. She looked the same, but everything else had changed. Meanwhile, in the quiet space of his penthouse, Alexander returned home later than usual. The city lights were already glowing outside, but inside, the silence felt different again, heavier than before. He set his keys down, walking slowly through the space, as if expecting something to correct itself. It did not. He opened a cabinet, then paused. The tea was not there. Not prepared. Not waiting. His hand rested on the edge of the counter for a moment longer than necessary, his jaw tightening slightly. It was a small thing. Insignificant. Yet it was not. Somewhere across the city, Sophie moved quickly through her new responsibilities, her hands steady, her movements efficient, her mind focused on one thing only. Earning enough. Saving enough. Doing whatever it took. But beneath that determination, something quieter remained. A memory of a place she had left behind. A place where she had been invisible, until the moment she chose to disappear. And neither of them knew yet that the choices they were making now were pulling them closer to a moment that would force them to face everything they had tried to ignore. The decision to leave had been quiet, but its impact began to echo louder with each passing hour. Sophie Bennett did not return to the penthouse. She did not call. She did not leave a message beyond the silence that now filled every corner she once occupied. In her place, there was only absence, and for the first time, absence had weight. Early that morning, before the city fully woke, she had returned one last time. The hallway had been empty, the marble floors cold beneath her steps as she moved with the same quiet precision she had always used. But this time, there was no routine, no schedule, no expectation waiting for her. She walked into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the space one final time, memorizing without meaning to. The place where she prepared his tea. The counter she wiped down every night. The faint reflection of a life she had been part of, but never truly seen in. From her pocket, she took out a small key and placed it gently on the counter. Beside it, a folded note, simple and clean, written in careful handwriting. "You will not need me anymore." She stood there for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter, as if something inside her hesitated, as if leaving was not as easy as she had made it sound. But then she straightened, her expression firm, and walked away without looking back. Now, hours later, Alexander Hayes stood in that same kitchen, the city stretching out beyond the glass, unaware that the moment he was about to face would mark the beginning of something he could not control. He had returned earlier than usual, a rare break in his routine driven by a subtle unrest he had refused to acknowledge. As he entered the penthouse, the silence greeted him again, heavier than before. He set his briefcase down, loosening his tie slightly as his gaze moved instinctively toward the kitchen. Something felt different. He stepped forward, his pace slowing as his eyes landed on the counter. The key, the note. For a second, he did not move. Then he picked up the paper, unfolding it with a precision that matched everything else about him. Yet his fingers lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. "You will not need me anymore." The words were simple, direct, final. His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes scanning the sentence again as if it might change if he looked at it long enough. It did not. He set the note down carefully, too carefully, as if the act required more control than it should have. "Replaceable," he said under his breath, the word echoing faintly in the quiet space. That was what he had called her. The memory surfaced without warning, sharper now, heavier than it had been in the moment. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the kitchen, noticing details that had once been invisible. The organized drawers, the polished surfaces, the quiet order that no longer maintained itself. He opened a cabinet, then another, as if expecting something to appear, something to correct what was missing. Nothing did. Meanwhile, across the city, Sophie moved through her new environment with relentless focus, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones. She followed every instruction, completed every task, pushed through every ache, because stopping was not an option she could afford. Yet even as she worked, a part of her mind remained elsewhere, replaying the moment she had walked away, not with regret, but with a quiet understanding that some things could not be endured forever. Back in the penthouse, Alexander stood alone, the note still resting on the counter, the key untouched beside it. For the first time in a long time, he did not reach for his phone. He did not call for assistance. He did not replace what was gone. Instead, he remained still, the silence pressing in around him, forcing him to confront something unfamiliar. Not anger, not inconvenience, but the faint, unsettling realization that what he had dismissed so easily had not been small at all. And now it was gone. The silence did not fade. It settled in. It spread through the penthouse in ways Alexander Hayes could not ignore, no matter how much he tried to return to the rhythm that had always defined his life. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual, not because of discipline, but because something felt incomplete. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where a cup of tea should have been waiting, his hand resting lightly on the counter as if expecting something to appear. It did not. He exhaled slowly, turning away, telling himself it was insignificant, that routines changed, that people were replaceable. Yet the thought did not hold the same weight it once had. As the day continued, small disruptions began to surface. A meeting file was not where it should have been. His schedule had minor inconsistencies. The order he had taken for granted was no longer seamless. None of it was catastrophic, nothing that could not be fixed, but each detail carried a quiet reminder of something that had once been effortless. By the time evening arrived, The penthouse felt larger than it ever had, the silence stretching wider, deeper, pressing against him in a way he could not explain. He moved through the space slowly, his steps measured, his gaze catching on things he had never noticed before. A jacket hanging neatly in his closet, it seemed repaired with careful stitching. A drawer organized with precision that spoke of patience rather than obligation. He paused, his fingers brushing lightly over the fabric, his expression tightening as the realization deepened. None of this had been accidental. Meanwhile, across the city, Sophie Bennett worked through another long shift, her movements steady, her focus unwavering despite the exhaustion that lingered beneath the surface. The new environment demanded more, expected perfection without pause, and she gave it everything she had. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Every hour she worked translated into a chance, however small, to keep her promise. Yet even as she moved through her responsibilities, fragments of her past routine surfaced in quiet moments. The timing of preparing tea, the habit of checking doors before nightfall. Small actions that had once defined her days now felt like echoes, reminders of a life she had left behind. Back in the penthouse, Alexander stood in the doorway of his office, his gaze fixed on the space where Sophie had once stood. The memory returned again, sharper this time, not just the image, but the tone of his own voice. "If you are going to cry, do it somewhere I cannot see." He frowned slightly, the words no longer sounding like authority, but something colder, something unnecessary. He stepped inside, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each step carried weight he had not felt before. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him back into the world he understood, a world of decisions and control. But even as he answered, part of his attention remained elsewhere. After the call ended, he remained still, his gaze drifting once more to the empty space, the absence that now felt undeniable. He walked back into the kitchen, picking up the note again, reading it for the third time. "You will not need me anymore." His jaw tightened slightly, but this time, there was no dismissal, no immediate rejection of the meaning behind the words. Instead, there was a pause, longer than before, heavier. Somewhere within that pause, a realization began to take shape, slow and unwelcome. It was not that he did not need her. It was that he had never allowed himself to see that he did. And now, the cost of that blindness was unfolding around him, not in dramatic collapse, but in quiet, persistent absence. Across the city, Sophie finally stepped outside after her shift, the night air cool against her skin, her body tired but her mind still moving forward. She looked up at the city lights for a brief moment, her expression calm, but distant. She had made her choice. She had walked away, and she did not intend to go back. Yet somewhere deep within the city, two paths were beginning to bend, slowly, inevitably, toward a moment neither of them could avoid, a moment where absence would no longer be something they could ignore. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as Alexander Hayes began to see what had always been there, but had never demanded his attention. That evening, instead of retreating into his office, he moved through the penthouse with a different kind of awareness, his steps quieter, his gaze more deliberate. He opened drawers he had never opened himself before, not out of necessity, but out of something closer to curiosity. Inside one of them, neatly arranged, he found a small collection of items that did not belong to him. A simple notebook, a pen with worn edges, and beneath them, a stack of folded papers. He hesitated for a moment, then picked them up, unfolding the first page carefully. It was a receipt. Hospital charges. The numbers were higher than he expected, but it was not the amount that held his attention. It was the frequency. Date after date. Each one recent. Each one marked as urgent. His expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as he turned to the next page. More documents. Medical forms. Notes written in careful handwriting, outlining medications, schedules, instructions. He read silently, his eyes moving slower now, as if each word carried more weight than the last. She had been dealing with this alone. The thoughts settled heavily, pressing against the image he had built of her, an image that now felt incomplete, shallow. He set the papers down on the counter, his fingers lingering on the edges, his mind replaying moments he had dismissed without thought. The time she arrived late by only a few minutes. The faint exhaustion in her posture. The silence she carried with her, not as absence, but as restraint. Across the city, Sophie Bennett sat beside her brother once again. Her posture slumped slightly now that the adrenaline of constant movement had begun to fade. The doctor had spoken to her earlier that day, his tone more urgent than before. The procedure could not wait much longer. Every delay narrowed their chances. Sophie listened, nodding, asking questions she already knew the answers to, because asking was the only way to feel like she still had some control. After he left, she remained seated, her hand resting gently over Daniel's, her gaze fixed on the steady rhythm of the monitor. "I am close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just a little more time." Back in the penthouse, Alexander moved again, his attention drawn to the kitchen, to the space that now felt like the center of something he had never understood. He opened a cabinet and paused, noticing a row of tea boxes arranged with quiet precision. Each one labeled, each one chosen intentionally. He reached for one, reading the label slowly, as if it might reveal something beyond its simple name. Chamomile. Sleep support. His brow tightened slightly. He did not remember buying it. He did not remember asking for it. Yet it had been there, waiting, every night, unnoticed. He set it back carefully, his movements slower now, more thoughtful. The pattern was becoming clear, and with it came a realization that did not sit comfortably. She had not just been working. She had been caring. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something he had never paused to recognize. He walked back to the counter, picking up the note again, reading it one more time. "You will not need me anymore." This time, the words felt different. Not like a statement, like a decision. Across the city, Sophie stood by the hospital window, looking out at the same skyline that stretched beyond his penthouse, though from a very different place. Her reflection stared back at her, tired but unbroken. She had given everything she could, and now she was giving more. There was no room left for hesitation, no space for looking back. Yet even as she turned away from the window, her mind lingered for a fraction of a second, not on regret, but on something unresolved, something left behind without closure. And in that same city, standing alone in a space that no longer felt complete, Alexander Hayes finally allowed a question to form, one he had never needed to ask before. Not where she went, but why he had never seen her before she did. The question did not leave Alexander Hayes alone. It followed him into the next morning, into his office, into every conversation that suddenly felt less important than it had the day before. For the first time in years, his focus fractured, not because of pressure, but because of something far quieter, far more persistent. He sat at his desk, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. Yet his attention remained fixed on the papers he had brought with him. The hospital receipts, the handwritten notes, proof of a life he had never asked about, a struggle he had never noticed. He pressed his fingers lightly against the edge of the desk, his jaw tightening as the realization settled deeper. She had been standing in front of him every day, carrying something that would have broken most people, and he had told her to take her tears somewhere he could not see. The memory no longer felt distant. It felt immediate. Unacceptable. He reached for his phone without thinking, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air as a new problem surfaced. He did not know where she was. The thought landed harder than expected. He had never needed to know. People in his world were always accessible, always within reach, always replaceable. But Sophie Bennett was no longer part of that system. She had stepped outside of it, and now he was the one left without access. His assistant entered the office quietly, pausing when she noticed the tension in his posture. "Is there something you need?" she asked carefully. Alexander looked up, his expression sharper than usual, but there was something else beneath it now, something less controlled. "Find her," he said. The words came out firm, but not cold. "I want to know where she is working now." His assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised not by the request, but by the urgency behind it. "Of course," she replied, already turning to leave. Meanwhile, across the city, Sophie Bennett was running out of time. The doctor had been clear that morning. The window for the procedure was narrowing, and the risk was increasing with every passing day. She stood outside the billing office, a printed estimate in her hand, the numbers staring back at her like something impossible, something unreachable. Her fingers tightened around the paper, but her expression did not break. She had come too far to stop now. Inside her mind, calculations moved quickly, faster than her circumstances could keep up with. The new job was not enough. Not yet. She needed more. She needed something she had been avoiding. Her phone buzzed again, a message from the agency confirming an additional placement opportunity. Overnight shift. Higher pay. Immediate start. Sophie stared at the screen for a moment, her body already exhausted, her mind already stretched thin. But there was no real decision to make. She typed a single response. I accept. Back in the office, Alexander stood by the window, his phone now in his hand, but still unused. For a man who controlled everything, this waiting felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable. He was not used to searching. He was used to being found. Minutes passed, then longer, until finally his assistant returned, her expression composed, but carrying information that mattered. We located her, she said. She is working through a private staffing agency. Multiple placements. Long hours. Alexander did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze shifting from the skyline to her, his expression unreadable for a brief moment before it settled into something more defined. Where, he asked. His voice was calm, but there was no distance in it now. There was intent. Across the city, Sophie stepped back into the hospital room, her movements slower than before, the weight of her choices beginning to show. She sat beside her brother once again, her hand finding his, her thumb brushing gently over his skin. I am still here, she whispered softly. I am not going anywhere. Yet even as she spoke, the cost of that promise was rising, pulling her further into a life she had never planned, a life that demanded more than she had ever given before. And somewhere not far away, for the first time in his life, Alexander Hayes was no longer waiting for the world to come to him. He was about to go after something he had already lost. The location came through just before sunset. A quiet message, precise and efficient, delivered to Alexander Hayes without delay. She is currently assigned to a private residence on the Upper East Side, with additional overnight shifts at a medical facility downtown. Long hours. Minimal rest. He read the message once, then again, his expression tightening not with anger, but with something far less familiar. Concern. Without another word, he stood, grabbing his coat, moving with a decisiveness that had built his empire, but now driven by something far more personal. This was no longer about control. It was about correction. Across the city, Sophie Bennett was already at her second shift of the day. The hospital lights were harsh, the air sterile, the hours stretching endlessly as fatigue settled deep into her body. She moved carefully, deliberately, her steps slower now, but still steady. She checked charts, adjusted equipment, followed instructions without error, because failure was not something she could afford. Not now. Not when every hour mattered. Yet her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking, her strength thinning under the weight she carried alone. Hours passed, blending into each other, until the moment her body finally began to push back. She stepped into a quiet hallway, her vision blurring slightly as she pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself. Just a moment, she whispered, more to her body than her mind. Just a moment. But the moment stretched longer than she expected. The world tilted, subtly at first, then more sharply, until her knees gave way and she sank down, the strength she had forced into place finally slipping through her grasp. The sound of something falling echoed faintly, drawing the attention of a nearby nurse who rushed toward her, calling out for assistance. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, a black car pulled to a stop. Alexander stepped out, his gaze sharp, scanning the entrance as if the building itself held the answers he was looking for. He moved quickly, his stride purposeful, his focus fixed. Inside, the atmosphere shifted as staff moved with urgency, voices low but tense. He followed the motion instinctively, his presence commanding attention without effort, until he saw her. Sophie sat against the wall, her head lowered slightly, a nurse beside her checking her pulse, speaking softly, asking questions. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not weaker, just worn. For a moment, he did not move. The image held him there, forcing him to see what he had never allowed himself to see before. Not a role, not a position, a person who had been breaking quietly in front of him while he chose not to look. Sophie lifted her head slightly, her eyes unfocused at first, then sharpening as she became aware of her surroundings. And then she saw him. The recognition was immediate. The shift in her expression subtle, but undeniable. Not surprise. Not relief. Something more guarded. More distant. You should not be here, she said softly, her voice strained but steady. Alexander stepped closer, ignoring the nurse's brief hesitation, his attention fixed entirely on her. I was looking for you, he replied, his tone calm, but lacking the cold edge it once carried. Sophie shook her head slightly, pushing herself up with quiet effort, her hand brushing the nurse's arm in silent thanks. You found me, she said, meeting his gaze directly now. That does not change anything. The space between them felt different than before, not defined by hierarchy, defined by what had been broken. Alexander studied her for a moment, his expression controlled, but no longer distant. You are overworking yourself, he said. You are exhausted. She let out a quiet breath, something almost like a faint, tired laugh, but without humor. I do not have a choice, she answered. You would not understand. The words were not sharp. They were honest. And that honesty landed heavier than any accusation. Alexander did not respond immediately. For the first time, he did not argue. He did not assert control. Instead, he stood there, facing the reality of her world, a world he had never needed to consider before. Then help me understand, he said finally, his voice lower now, steadier. Sophie held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable, caught between exhaustion and something deeper, something unresolved. And in that moment, the distance between them was no longer measured by status, but by everything that had been left unsaid. The hallway had grown quiet again, but the tension between them had not faded. Sophie Bennett stood there, her shoulders squared despite the exhaustion that still lingered in her body, her eyes steady as she looked at Alexander Hayes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the hospital continued around them, distant and detached, as if the world had moved slightly out of focus, leaving only the space between them clear and unavoidable. You want to understand, she said finally, her voice calm but carrying a weight that had been building for far too long. Then listen, not as my employer, not as someone who thinks everything can be fixed with a decision. Just listen. Alexander did not interrupt. He did not correct her. He simply nodded once, a small gesture, but one that marked a shift in something fundamental. Sophie took a slow breath, her hand brushing lightly against the wall beside her, as if grounding herself before she continued. My brother is in that room because I cannot afford to lose him, she said, her voice steady but softer now. Every shift I take, every hour I work, it is for him. The hospital bills you saw, those are not numbers to me. They are time. Time I'm trying to buy. Her gaze did not waver, even as the truth settled between them. And when I was standing in front of you, trying not to fall apart, I was not asking for anything. I was just trying to hold it together long enough to keep going. The words were not loud, but they landed with a force that Alexander could not ignore, could not dismiss. He looked at her, really looked at her, the exhaustion in her posture, the strength in her voice, the quiet dignity she had carried even when he had refused to see it. I did not know, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the certainty it once held. Sophie shook her head slightly. No, she replied. You did not want to know. The difference was small, but it mattered. He accepted it without argument. That alone would have been unthinkable days before. The nurse nearby stepped back slightly, sensing the gravity of the moment, giving them space without needing to be asked. Alexander took a step closer, but not enough to close the distance entirely. Not yet. Let me help, he said. The words came carefully, not as an order, not as a solution, but as something offered. Sophie's expression changed, not with surprise, but with something more guarded. I do not need charity, she answered quietly. This is not about charity, he said, his tone steady, his gaze holding hers without force. It is about responsibility. Her brow tightened slightly, a flicker of something crossing her expression. Responsibility, she repeated. You did not feel responsible when I was right in front of you. The truth in her words did not leave room for denial. Alexander inhaled slowly, the weight of that truth settling fully now. You are right, he said. There was no hesitation, no defense, just acknowledgement. I was wrong. The simplicity of the words carried more impact than anything else he could have said. Sophie looked at him, searching his expression for something familiar, something cold, something dismissive. It was not there. That absence unsettled her more than anything else. You cannot undo that, she said softly. No, he agreed. But I can choose what I do now. The space between them remained, but something within it had shifted. Not resolved, not healed, but no longer ignored. Sophie glanced briefly toward the room where her brother lay, then back at him, her eyes reflecting the weight of everything she carried. I am not going back, she said, her voice firm despite the quiet. Alexander nodded once. I am not asking you to, he replied. And for the first time, his words did not sound like control. They sounded like understanding. The moment stretched, fragile, uncertain, but real. And in that space, something began to change, not in grand gestures, not in promises, but in the quiet recognition of what had been lost, and what might still be possible if they were both willing to face it. The conversation ended without a clear resolution, but something had already begun to shift beneath the surface. Sophie Bennett did not ask him to stay, and Alexander Hayes did not force the moment to stretch longer than it needed to. He stepped back first, giving her space, something he had never considered before, and without another word, he turned and walked away. Not out of dismissal, but out of understanding that some actions needed to happen without an audience. Sophie watched him go, her expression unreadable, her body still tense from everything that had been said. She did not believe in sudden change. She did not trust words that came too late. And yet, something in his tone lingered, something she could not immediately dismiss. She turned back toward her brother's room, pushing the moment aside, because there were more urgent things that demanded her attention. Inside the room, the steady rhythm of the monitor continued, unchanged, indifferent to everything happening beyond its walls. Sophie sat beside Daniel once again, her hand finding his, her voice soft as she spoke to him about ordinary things, about small memories, about anything that made the room feel less like a place of waiting. Time passed slowly, measured in breaths and quiet hope. Hours later, after her shift had ended and the night had deepened, Sophie stepped out into the hallway, her body heavy, her mind exhausted, but her resolve still intact. She did not notice the quiet movement happening beyond her awareness, the decisions being made without her knowledge. Across the city, Alexander Hayes stood in his office, the lights dimmed, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass. He held his phone in his hand, his expression calm, but focused in a way that had nothing to do with business. He had spent the last several hours reviewing everything his assistant had gathered. The hospital, the procedure, the cost, the timeline. Each detail had been laid out clearly, efficiently, the way he preferred. But this was not a transaction. This was a life. He dialed a number, his tone direct when the call was answered. I want the procedure scheduled immediately, he said. Full coverage. No delays. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by confirmation. Alexander ended the call without hesitation, setting the phone down as if the decision required no further thought. But he did not stop there. He contacted the hospital administration, ensuring that everything would move forward without obstruction, without waiting for approvals that would cost precious time. He did not attach his name. He did not leave a trace that would lead back to him. This was not about recognition. It was about correction. Back at the hospital, a nurse approached Sophie quietly, her expression carrying a hint of something unusual. Miss Bennett, she said gently, we need to update you on your brother's case. Sophie stood immediately, her heart tightening as she followed the nurse down the hallway, her mind preparing for the worst, because that was what she had learned to expect. But when the doctor spoke, the words were different. The procedure had been approved. Fully funded. Immediate scheduling. Sophie blinked, the meaning taking a moment to settle, her thoughts struggling to catch up with what she was hearing. That is not possible, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. The doctor gave a small, reassuring nod. It has already been arranged. You do not need to worry about the cost anymore. For the first time in days, Sophie felt something shift inside her, something fragile and unfamiliar. Not relief. Not yet. But the beginning of it. She stood there, her mind searching for an explanation, for a name, for a reason, but there was nothing. Only the result. Later that night, as she sat beside her brother once again, her hand resting gently over his, her gaze softened slightly, her shoulders no longer carrying the same weight. Somewhere in the city, a man who had once ignored her pain had chosen to act without being seen, without being thanked, without expecting anything in return. And though she did not know it yet, The silence he had once used to avoid her had become the very thing he now used to protect her. And in that quiet, something real began to take shape. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded slowly, carefully, as if the world itself understood that some moments needed time to become real. The surgery was scheduled without delay, and for the first time in weeks, Sophie Bennett allowed herself to sit without calculating, without planning, without bracing for what might go wrong. She remained by her brother's side as the medical team prepared, her hand resting gently over his, her voice soft as she spoke to him, telling him he was going to be all right, telling him she would still be there when he woke up. When they finally wheeled him away, she stood in the hallway, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on the doors long after they had closed. Time moved differently after that. Minutes felt like hours, and every passing second carried both hope and fear in equal measure. When the doctor finally returned, his expression calm but reassuring, Sophie felt her breath catch before he even spoke. The procedure was successful. The words settled into her slowly, almost unreal at first, until the meaning fully reached her. Her knees weakened slightly, and she reached for the nearest chair, sitting down as a quiet, overwhelming wave of relief washed through her. She did not cry, not because she could not, but because the feeling was too deep for tears. It was something steadier, something lasting. Hours later, when she was finally allowed to see him again, Daniel lay resting peacefully, the tension that had once surrounded him gone, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like a beginning. Sophie sat beside him, her hand gently holding his, her voice barely above a whisper. "You made it," she said softly. "We made it." Across the city, Alexander Hayes stood in his penthouse, looking out over the skyline that had once defined everything he believed mattered. The lights stretched endlessly, but for the first time, they did not hold his full attention. His phone rested on the counter, silent now, the decisions he had made already set into motion, already complete. He had not returned to the hospital. He had not asked for updates beyond what was necessary. This had never been about recognition. It had been about doing what should have been done long before it was needed. Days later, Sophie stepped out of the hospital into the clear morning light, her steps slower, but lighter than they had been in a long time. The weight she had carried for so long had shifted, not gone entirely, but no longer crushing. She paused on the sidewalk, taking in a quiet breath, allowing herself to feel something she had not allowed in weeks. Peace. As she began to walk, a familiar figure stood across the street, waiting, not approaching, not calling out, simply there. Alexander Hayes did not move toward her. He gave her the choice. Sophie noticed him almost immediately, her steps slowing as their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she walked toward him. Not because she needed to, because she chose to. When she stopped a few feet away, the silence between them felt different than before. Not heavy, not broken, just honest. "You knew," she said quietly. It was not a question. Alexander met her gaze, his expression steady, no longer guarded, no longer distant. "I understood enough," he replied. Sophie studied him for a moment, searching for something that no longer seemed to be there. The coldness, the distance. It had been replaced by something quieter, something real. "You did not tell me," she said. He shook his head slightly. "It was not something I needed you to thank me for." The simplicity of the answer settled between them, and for the first time, Sophie felt something shift that was not tied to survival, not tied to obligation. Something personal. She let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. This time, she said softly, "I see you." The words mirrored something deeper than they appeared, something that reached back to everything that had been missed before. Alexander nodded once, accepting them without adding more. They stood there for a moment longer, the city moving around them, but no longer separating them. And in that quiet space, without promises, without pressure, something real began to take root. Not built on status, not built on need, but on understanding. And this time, neither of them chose to look away.